Hi, my name is Kamil, and in this video I will show you how to use GroomBear. And just to clarify, it's not about the grooming itself, but about the tool and its core features. Okay, so before we start, switch main radial menu to GroomBear's one. You can also add GroomBear's shelf. Maybe in the future you'll find there a few more entries. I also recommend you to review help page before you start grooming. It's quite detailed and explains every GroomBear's parameter, including the ones that I will not cover in this video. There are also some GIFs that will show you how the brushes work. You can find out hotkeys for each mode and so on. Okay, now I will say a few words about my grooming scene. By the way, you can find this scene in the examples folder that is attached to the tool. Here I have bear model from Maya, and it's animated for grooming purposes, just to make it easier to groom in the overlapping places, I would say. To match Houdini units, I'm scaling my alembic node because it was modeled in centimeters. So finally, inside Houdini it is around 2 units long and 1 unit high. Then I have regular alembic node with the bear inside, and the collider, which is essentially the same as alembic. There is also bear skin, which is exactly the same geometry as collider as well, but without teeth, mouth, claws and eyes. Reason for separating collider and skin is that I don't want to create guides on eyes, for instance. And also you can always modify your collider geometry. So for example, you can add some claws and nothing will break. And then just you can resolve collisions with those claws. I have also Bear's VDB, but I probably will not use it in this tutorial. I actually hardly ever use VDBs because they tend to be less accurate, but for complex geometry, VDB collisions should be more stable and faster than surface one, so in some cases you might find them useful. Now let's add some fur to the skin. I press enter with nothing selected when it asks for animated geometry. Deforming the fur is quite a different topic and there's a lot to cover. Hopefully the GroomBear's toolkit will be updated soon, and I will also create some tutorials covering this topic. Remember to provide path to your VDB collider. So press C, go to base options, tools and groom. Initially the width is set up to a pretty high value, so you can modify it to match your current scale. I also like to make the tips thinner so I can distinguish roots from the tips. Also, you can enable custom shader toggle to have the curves shaded evenly. As you can see, there are intersections between guides and the eye. This is because GroomBear uses skin input as default collider, and our skin is eyeless, so it works as expected. Now I will show you how to use separate collider. Remember, if you use a skin as collider, it's not required at all. It is just a matter of my setup. I will just import my collider geometry by the object merge node and connect it to the last input. You also need to set a collider type to custom surface. Okay, now the collisions work properly, so we are ready for grooming. To set brush radius, you can press Shift, middle mouse button and drag horizontally. The same for strength value, you can press Ctrl, middle mouse button and also drag. I'll just minimize some bars to make more space. By pressing C, you are activating GroomBear's radial menu, and I really recommend using it because it speeds up workflow in comparison to just clicking the parameters over. In mode options, you have only available toggles and buttons for current mode. So, for example, you can turn off maintaining length, and that's it. The same for switching brushes, Falloffs, tools, visibility. Essentially, the radial menu gives you full control over GroomBear. On the GroomBear's help page, you'll find how to set up custom hotkeys and custom radial menu entries. Let's say you want to create mask, just C, masks, select, enter. To invert mask, just use the same and press Ctrl I. I usually just collapse all folders inside Brush tab and expand only mode options and manual falloffs. You can also change colors in the Settings tab. Affected color is quite useful for masking purposes, so recently modified or created curves can be easily masked. For example, in Scatter Brush, you can mask recently created curves by Affected button. If you want to save your changes, you can override default values with type properties, just like for any digital asset. You can use copy defaults from node. Just remember, do it on node that doesn't have any curves cached. So just disconnect everything from GroomBear and recache input curves. Then you can save digital asset without loaded geometry. Keep in mind, this is just digital asset wrapper, so you can't modify existing brushes, but you can extend it with everything else. Okay, now I will show you a draw brush. Switch to draw. I will draw a few guides from different camera angles. As you can see, every curve is projected on different screen plane, and I used to forget about this, especially at the beginning, when the curve I've drawn had a different orientation than I thought. So in the end I had to remove that curve and draw it once again. That's why there is an option Snap to Skin that allows you to draw directly on the skin surface instead of the screen plane. I will show you how it works. First, I'm drawing a curve with no Snap to Skin option. It looks like this. Next, I select Snap to Skin and the curve lies on the surface. The difference is quite big. In general, I use Snap to Skin every time I don't have to draw in a screen space. For example, in the situation like this, when I can draw only on the skin, it's easier to have Snap to Skin enabled because drawing is more predictable. I can control offset distance from the skin with collision width parameter. If the Snap to Skin option is enabled and you don't draw your curve directly on the skin, it will be Snap to Skin anyway, as you can see here. Here we have the parameter remove below that is also included in some other brushes. It's useful when you draw a small curve by mistake or just click somewhere on the skin. It will simply remove the curve below specified length. Otherwise, such a small curve could cause problems when it comes to hair generation. So this way you can ensure that you don't have invisible guide somewhere. I will show you how it works. Now let's draw a very small one. This one is still above 0.001, so it wasn't removed. Anyway, when I increase the parameter a bit more, I will not be able to draw any curve that is shorter than this value. Let's talk about guides resolution. As you can see here, I cannot maintain my drawn curve shape, and it's because I have pretty low segment count. If the curve we draw is especially long, it's better to increase segment count, for example to 25. Now, while drawing the hair, there are still 9 segments because by default my curves always resample to the average value, and as my previous curves had 9 segments, the average value is 9. If you want to force the existing curves to increase to 25 segments, you have 2 ways. First, you can change resample mode to a default value, and your curves will be forced to have such a segment count. The second method is to leave the resample mode option as it was at the average value. Go to the tools and use resample tool with the desired segment count. I always use the second option as it's much faster to set up. If you don't have any guides and want to create new grooming with more segments, you can just set segment count in the settings tab and all new guides will be created with specified value. so you don't have to worry about other parameters. Now smooth drawing. Maybe I will show it on a sample. Disable smooth drawing. And it's hard to see now because auto resample smooths curves anyway, but when I enable this toggle, the curves is smoother. You can also modify the number of passes to get something similar to the lazy mouse effect. I will also show you the collisions now, as they are very visible in the draw mode. As you can see, the collisions here are gradual, and the collision radius is set up along this ramp. We can change the ramp so the collisions are flatter, but usually it's faster to set the flat collisions parameter. It's exactly the same as setting collision ramp flat. I only use flat collisions when my curves are long, and I want to have the same collisions along the whole length. Gradual collisions are also very useful for curly hairs. We just have to set up the collision width value, for example 0.04. As here we have the gradual collisions, it's very easy to create the curls. It doesn't matter if we have snap to skin enabled, as long as we draw it from good angle. And as you can see, with the flat collisions enabled, it would not work as expected. Okay, now let's talk about the scattering. Scatter parameters are sensitive to the size of our skin geometry, and as our bear is around 1 unit size, the default values for scatter brush will work like so. The crucial parameter here is closeness, which states what the distance between the guides should be. And thanks to that, we have an equal distribution of the curves, and we don't have to relax them later. For example, when you want to increase the number of curves, you can simply lower the closeness, and as the new distance is shorter, you will be able to scatter more guides, and those should be still evenly distributed. As you can see, there are no overlaps. To show it more clearly, I will create a kind of gap in our guides, and as you can see, you can use scatter to fill it. And of course, if you lower the closeness parameter even more, for example to 0.02, you will be able to scatter more curves, and it will also fill all other gaps on the skin. By pressing Ctrl, you can delete the curves. If you turn off the interpolate toggle, you will be able to create the straight curves. And if you zero out the closeness parameter, then the density value will decide how many curves will be created. Of course, they will overlap each other then, because we are scattering them in random fashion now. Okay, quite cool option is initial brush. When it's enabled in scatter mode, we have full control on where the single curve is being created, so positioning is very accurate. And just to let you know, every brush with sub-brushes inside, like for example in scatter brush where we have remove and plant brush, will have short description in the mode options folder, and there you can find how to enable those sub-brushes. Now I will show animation snap feature. I will groom one finger because it was always the most difficult area for me while grooming. Of course, you can use animation snap on fully groomed character, but just to simplify, I'll present it on small region. So let's go to relaxed pose and scatter some curves. I have already proper parameter values for scatter brush. As you can see, when animation snap is disabled, guides are static, and when I enable it, guides will follow the forming geometry. Now let's do some grooming. I'm using shape brush with only a visible toggle disabled. This way I'm grooming on both sides of the skin. If we turn the animation snap on the incorrect frame, for example this one, the curves will snap to the closest position on the skin, so just be aware of that and always enable this toggle on the proper frame. Now I used Shape Brush in overlapping pose to resolve collisions. If you don't like the change, you can always undo on any frame. And now let's go back to the rest pose, and that's it. Now I will show you the masking module. Again, I will scatter some curves. First of all, we have affected and activated curves in GroomBear. For example, now by selecting the affected button, we are masking recently modified or created curves. By selecting activated button, we are masking curves that were modified or created exactly before releasing the left mouse button. We can also throw everything away from the mask, and the recently created curves will be automatically moved to the base mask. As I showed it before, to invert the mask you have to go to Select, press Ctrl I and press Enter. Select button gives us regular hidden selection, so you are allowed to use options like visible geometry only or lasso selection. We have also mask brush, so we can paint mask. Pressing Ctrl left mouse button will remove the mask. You can do it by painting over skin or just using screen space. All of the brushes cooperate with the masks, so for example, if we now paint the mask and go to the Scale and Force brush, it will only work for these selected curves and all other curves should stay unaffected. What's important, if we have any mask that we want to work with, we can expose it very easily by the toggle called Expose Mask. It's not only useful for grooming and clarity purposes, but also when only a selected mask is exposed, it increases the efficiency of the brushes, especially if the load of viewport is very huge. You can also toggle on Expose Active. It can be useful to quickly draw or scatter guides in very dense areas, so you can create your new guide very precisely. Now let's move to the Falloffs and why it's worth to use them. I will scatter some curves again and select Clamp Brush, as it will be very useful for what I'm going to show you. I will change Clamp method to the central curve. And now we can see the profile of clamp with default guide falloff and default radius exponent. This particular exponent always refers to the ramp below, so by changing the value of it, we can easily control the ramp. Of course, it's possible to modify ramp manually, but it would take much more time. I will show you now how the clamp can look like with the different exponent. I will need more curves. Let's increase this value here to around 3.5. And as you can see, the difference is quite significant. And all of this using only one parameter. That's how you can control it very easily. Now let's do the same on the comp brush. This is how combing by default looks like. In the combo brush, by pressing Ctrl, we can invert the ramp, so it will work this way. It is very helpful when we want to make some overlaps. And by increasing guide exponent, we can increase bending. Okay, now let's focus on the radius falloff. I will use clamp with initial brush toggle. I will select normal clamp method here. As you can see, it takes quite long for the curves to clamp on the borders, and this is because of the default ramp and default exponent. If we change the radius falloff to flat, the effect will be immediate and clamping will be much faster, what you can see now. Now I will show another example with custom ramps, this one using lift brush. Need to scatter some curves and give them a simple shape. I will show how it works by default maybe. I will turn off preserve shape, increase the lift to 1, and as you can notice, all the curves straighten. But now if I leave the lift at 1 and modify the ramp, we raise only the tips, which is quite handy. Now I will show you how the mirroring works. To turn it on, go to the base options and mirroring. No philosophy here, it works like in any package and it's available in every brush except edit mode. I actually hardly ever use live mirroring. I prefer to use mirror tool instead. It simply replaces the curves on the other side, and what's important, it doesn't slower the GroomBear the way the live mirroring does. To use it, we have to go to the tools and select mirror. Of course, every time we change something, we have to use it once again to reflect the change on the other side. We can also work on the masks, so we can, for example, move the curves here, and now I will use the mirror tool. And as you can see, only the selected curves have been copied on the other side. If it's about mirror tool, we can change the direction here. For live mirroring, there's a separate parameter that can be modified in the settings tab. Okay, now the paintbrush. I will paint float attribute named mask01. I will use it for Hergens clamping later. By pressing Ctrl, we can smooth our attributes. Let's move to the Hergen. We already have it clamped, and I will show you how to use our attribute. First, we have to transfer the attribute from our guides to generated hairs. Next, on the clamp node, we have to select guide attribute and type our mask name. As you see, clamps are only visible where we have painted them, and they are blending to the right side. Now I will show you the edit mode. Go to Brush, Edit. Edit mode operates on primitives and points. So if we press 4 on the keyboard, the whole curves will be selected and our pivot will snap on the selections route. By pressing 2, we can control selected points and pivot will snap on the selection center. I usually use handle in the camera space, which I recommend as it's much more convenient, at least for me. You can switch to it by pressing M key a few times. There's also a soft radius parameter, exactly the same one as on the soft transform node. If we increase it, we will gradually affect the nearest points. In this mode, geometry caching works differently. Although I rotate the curves, the collisions are always made once and are cached to GroomBear when you stop manipulating the handle. The curves can also be freely moved on the skin. If we turn off movable roots, the curves will be constrained to the root positions. Quite cool option is copying the curves, which allows us to copy many curves at once. And also the masks work the same way as for all the other brushes. So if, for example, I would like to choose inactive curves, I would not be able to grab those.